Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to our psychology revision classes in the evening. This is our last, I think, half hour for a while. Next week, we're going to our full hour revision blast. Tonight, we're going to be looking at biopsychology, and we're going to really be focusing on the A02 and A03. I'm Lara, this is Sarah here on screen, and Sarah's going to be kick-starting us off. Don't forget this is an interactive session, so we really encourage you to put your answers in the chat box. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Tutor2You where you'll get updates on all of the future revision blasts. All right, let's get started.
Good evening, everyone. So yeah, let's get going. Just to remind you of the assessment objectives that you'll be assessed on. We looked at some A01 skills last week for biopsychology topics, and today we'll be touching on our A02, so our apply, and our evaluate A03. So we're looking at applying knowledge to STEMs and also evaluating strengths and weaknesses and things like that. So let's start with ways of studying the brain. So you are required for the specification to know 4 different ways of investigating the brain. So the first is fMRIs. So this is a brain scan technique which measures blood flow when a person performs a task and creates a dynamic 3D map of the brain, highlighting which areas are involved in different neural activities. So blood flow is showing which areas of the brain are requiring the oxygen, and we can see that on the brain scan, so we can see which parts of the brain are active. The second part that we teach is about post-mortem examinations. So a post-mortem examination can be used to allow researchers to study the physical brain of a person who displayed a particular behaviour whilst they were alive. And you may have heard of this term, post-mortems, be used kind of in everyday life, and it is something that is conducted on people after they have passed away, but it can be useful to understand a disorder perhaps that they might have had whilst they were living, because we can actually look intrusively at the physical brain itself. The third part then is EEGs. So EEGs measure electrical activity through the brain. So electrodes will be attached to the head to measure these electrical impulses that are travelling through the brain. So small electrical charges are detected by the electrodes that are graphed over a period of time, and they indicate the level of activity in the brain. Often these are used to investigate sleep patterns and things like that. And then our fourth and final way to study the brain is ERPs. So they are event-related potentials, and they use similar equipment to EEGs. They're perhaps a newer technology, they're quite expensive. Not a lot of hospitals, or not all hospitals, have them. But the key difference with EEGs is that they are targeting a more specific area of the brain. A specific activity is studied, and any kind of noise is cancelled out. So EEGs kind of give us all the brain activity on a brain scan, whereas ERPs is looking at something a lot more specific. So we're moving on to our vengeance task, and essentially we want you to get involved with this. So in the chat, we want you to separate these statements into categories. So do they relate to EEGs or ERPs, or are they relevant to both? So if you want, and you've got a pen and paper in front of you, you can sketch a Venn diagram, the 2 circles that overlap, and in the middle is anything that is for both of them. Alternatively, we'd love to see your comments in the chat, and you can just put numbers against EEGs and numbers against ERPs and then numbers against both. So you've got 60 seconds. Off you go. Let's see if we can allocate our numbers correctly. Good luck. You can see some comments coming in already. Well done. I think we've still got a few seconds left. So any more contributions in the chat would be fantastic. I can see some accuracy already in some responses. Let's see if there's any student that can assign all numbers, all 7, to one of 3 categories. Thank you to a few of you who have given me a little bit more there. Well done. So let's see. Grey_M, we've got really good responses there. I'd say there's just one out of place. So let's have a look at some answers there. So sorry, it's hard to see everyone's responses and analyze those, but Grey_M, I think you've got everything but one correctly. So on the left hand side, we've got our EEG. So this is number 6 and number 5. So EEGs measures general brain activity, and it can be difficult to pinpoint the exact area or region of the activity because of lots of noise and extra information we're getting. On the right hand side, we've got ERPs, and that's 1, 3 and 4. So it produces an average of brain activity, it eliminates extraneous neural activity, and it records responses to a stimulus as well. So well done if you got those. Crossing over in the middle, statements that apply to both are use of electrodes attached to the scalp. They both do that, and they have a temporal resolution of about 1 to 10 milliseconds. So that again applies to both of them. So fantastic, really well done. Thank you for your contributions, and yeah, well done if you got those right. I'm going to pass back now to Lara for Devil's Advocate.
Okay, so as we always say with evaluation, it's great to be able to thoroughly discuss a point and give a counter argument in your evaluation, which we'd like to say maybe is higher order evaluation. So we've got this advantage here of fMRI, is that it's non-invasive. Unlike other scanning techniques, fMRI does not use radiation or involve inserting instruments directly into the brain and is therefore virtually risk-free. Now, if you want to counter-argue that, thinking about that fMRI point, how would you counter-argument that? I would like to know how we could give maybe a limitation of an fMRI. What have we got? What are some of the limitations of this? So answers in chat box when you are ready. So if anyone's ever had to have, for example, I don't know, if anyone's ever had to have a private fMRI, that might give you a bit of an indicator of a weakness. Yeah, and we've got some really good specialist key terminology coming up. We've got spatial resolution. We need to make sure we get the correct way round for spatial resolution and temporal resolution, which we're going to go through on the next slide. Yeah, well done. So we've got some points about causation coming up. That's really good. So again, we can't be specific and pinpoint where brain activity is taking place. That's really good. And that's really to tie in with temporal resolution, which I said we'll go through on the next slide. Any other weaknesses that we can think of? Kind of a clue, like I said, if anyone's ever gone for a private fMRI, what might be a disadvantage there of this particular brain scanning technique in comparison to other brain scanning techniques? Any ideas? Yeah, really good, Karen. Well done. So it can be quite expensive. Yeah, so let's review our counter argument that we've got up. Yeah, the equipment definitely is very expensive in contrast to other methods like an EEG. It's so expensive that some hospitals actually share fMRI equipment, which can lead to obviously delays for patients in getting these results. So yeah, really well done, and valid there with the point about causation as well. So really well done on noticing that. Let's have a look at our next devil's advocate. So here, let's make sure we understand what is meant by spatial resolution and temporal resolution. So fMRI actually have good spatial resolution. I know a few of you said that you thought it was bad. So we know that greater spatial resolution allows psychologists to discriminate between different brain regions with greater accuracy. In actual fact, fMRI scans have a spatial resolution of approximately 1 to 2 millimeters, which is significantly greater than other techniques such as EEG and ERP. So again, we've got an advantage there. What could we flip that with a disadvantage? And really think about maybe the idea of temporal resolution here. So does anyone know how we might be able to use temporal resolution here as the counter argument perhaps for fMRI? And if we just want a recap over what temporal resolution is, it's the accuracy of the scanner in relation to time. Yeah, well done, Eloise May. Yeah, they can have low temporal resolution. Sometimes delays can be up to 5 seconds. Yeah, absolutely well done. Yeah, anybody else want to add to that? So again, how is this going to link in? In other words, what's the so what here? This is going to link in with accuracy, isn't it? Obviously, for this particular brain scanning technique. Let's have a look at our reveal for our counter argument here. So like you have said, well done. They do have poor temporal resolution, actually of 1 to 4 seconds, which is worse than other techniques. So what does this mean? It means psychologists are unable to predict with a high degree of accuracy the onset of brain activity, because that's how delayed it is, yeah, up to roughly 4 seconds, let's say. Excellent, well done. What we're going to have a look at next is some news headlines where we do have some missing words, and I do believe some of us have probably played this before, but if you haven't, as you can see in the next slide, we have a missing word. So we've got the deficit a patient displays during their lifetime may not be linked to the deficits found in the brain. This is an issue of what? And we've actually already mentioned this word tonight. So what is this an issue of? Again, read that to yourself slowly. Yeah, excellent. Well done. We've got some good answers coming through. So definitely, yeah, cause and effect, we could say causation. Excellent. Yeah, cause and effect relationship. Well done. So if we reveal the answer, this is an issue, of course, of causation. Okay, excellent. Let's have a look at our next news headline. So if you want a good look at the something beginning with H, then a post-mortem is the only method you can use. So what could be the missing word here? Okay, so we've got some good H's coming through. We've got hippocampus. What's another area of the brain, guys, beginning with H, do we think? There's another area of the brain beginning with H. But yeah, we could obviously say hippocampus. Yeah. Hypothalamus is the one that we've got here for the missing word. Well done. So yeah, hypothalamus, then of course, if we want to look at this in detail, a post-mortem is the only method that you can use. Okay, let's have a look at the next news headline. Due to the nature of post-mortems, there are concerns about what? Wow, we got that straight away. Ethics, yeah, absolutely. Can anybody elaborate on that? Why is ethics an issue with post-mortem exactly? If you're going to explain that in a bit of detail, what is the issue there with ethics with a post-mortem? Can anyone tell me? Yeah, excellent. So someone who's not alive anymore is unable to obviously give consent to have a post-mortem. Yeah, so potentially some ethics there around consent. Yeah, really well done, guys, for noticing that. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to pass you over to Sarah next.
So we're going to have a look at some application then, so practicing our A02 skills. So using, of course, our ways of studying the brain that we've been talking about. So a psychologist was interested in investigating whether visual information presented very briefly is attended to by the brain. Identify 2 ways of studying the brain that would be appropriate for the psychologist to use in this investigation, and justify your answers for 4 marks. So 2 ways, you can break this down and think of this as 2 markers. So the first thing you want to do is to choose 2 ways of studying the brain, and of course you need for the specification to know 4. So you need to choose 2, perhaps the 2 that you feel that you know the most about, but then read the STEM again to do step 2 and check that these are appropriate for this STEM. So, if you choose fMRI and EEG, go back and read and check that they are appropriate for this STEM. And number 3, step 3, if they are appropriate, then explain why they're appropriate. So let's have a look at an example. So, for example, we've said that one appropriate technique to use would be an fMRI scan, and this is because it is non-invasive and risk-free, and due to the high spatial resolution of the images produced, it would be possible to tell whether the visual information is being processed in a specific area of the brain. Okay, so we've done kind of half of the answer there. We need to do the other half, so let's have a look. We want you to attempt to complete this. So using, for example, ERPs, your knowledge of that, could you, in the chat for us, draft an answer for the second half of this question? So remember, the question is asking you to identify the way of studying the brain, and we've suggested ERPs, and why it's appropriate to use in this investigation. So have a go at drafting a sentence or two in the chat there for us. I appreciate this could take a moment. So we're doing that for ERPs now. Appreciate this could take a minute, so I'm just looking for some answers in the chat. So thinking of the good things about ERPs that we mentioned when we did our Venn diagram, what's good about it, and therefore why would it be appropriate for this specific situation. Just looking for any answers in the chat there. We may have to give a suggestion. Just due to time, we'll jump in there with a suggestion of sorry, I have just seen one pop up in the chat. Can identify different stimuli and where it triggers in the brain. Really good contribution there, Eloise. Thank you so much for that. ERPs have good temporal resolution, so therefore would record more accurate data. Lovely. Okay, so we said another appropriate technique would be to use ERPs. That's just a typo there. This is because the technique can isolate specific responses. The psychologist should be able to see whether the brain is attending to the presentation of the specific visual stimulus or not. Thank you so much for your contributions there. Let's move on to writing evaluation. So we're looking now at kind of our structure of how we would structure an A03 point here. So we like to use the analogy of a burger. So a top bun is the point that you're making, the P. The burger, the meaty bit, is the elaboration on your point, the evidence, the examples, the details to your point. That's the meaty bit. That's very important. And then the bottom bun is the explanation of what it means and kind of the link. So why your point matters. And I do like to teach my students to start this sentence with "this matters because," why is this important? Why are we sharing this information, essentially? So let's have a look at an example. We've given you a point of one strength of fMRIs is that they have high spatial resolution. The burger, the evidence, the elaboration, is that they can depict detail by the millimeter. So it's possible to image the human brain in action, and this allows the researchers to produce a map of active brain regions when performing tasks. So we want you to give us an idea, a sentence or two for the bottom bun. So why does this matter? How can you finish this off? So attempt to answer that question. Why is this important? Why does it matter? Again, have a go in the chat for me. I'm just going to read your contributions from the previous slide. Thank you for that. Yeah, good contributions from before. So finishing off this evaluation point then, why does this matter? We could start this with "this matters because," or "therefore," finishing off this point. Why is this important? Thank you so much, Lily, for your contribution. So this is important because fMRIs can produce highly reliable evidence to suggest what areas of the brain are stimulated. Sorry, it's jumped because lots of people have commented. Thank you. Bispecific pass, yeah. Fantastic, really good contribution, and well done for using the sentence starter there. Let's have a look at what we put. So therefore, fMRIs have helped to develop our understanding of localization of function, and this is obviously necessary and useful for the development of psychology. Thank you so much for your contributions there. Appreciate everyone has put time into constructing a good final point for that, so well done. I'm going to pass over to Lara to talk about the fight or flight response.
Okay, thank you. So before we get into some application for fight or flight, let's just go through some of the theories of recap. So there's some kind of key specialist terminology that we want to make sure that we're mentioning here. Firstly, it starts at the amygdala when there's a stressful situation, which we know is part of the limbic system. Now that is activated when there's stress, and it sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus. And this is really probably most likely where you might start your kind of A01. The hypothalamus activates what we know as the SAM pathway, also known as the sympathomedullary pathway. Okay, so you need to know what SAM stands for, and a really good way to remember that. Some students have quite difficulty remembering what SAM stands for, but just got to remember that the hypothalamus does activate the sympathetic nervous system through the adrenal medulla, hence sympathomedullary pathway. So again, those words kind of are significant in this pathway because adrenal medulla is activated, which therefore activates through the sympathetic nervous system. So the adrenal medulla we know is part of the adrenal glands, and obviously this secretes the hormones adrenaline and noradrenaline into the bloodstream, and that causes a number of physiological changes to prepare the body for fight or flight. So we're going to go through some multiple choice questions first before we get onto an A02 activity on this. So just pop your answers in the chat box when you're ready, guys. The fight or flight response does not account for which of the following? A, B, or C? Okay, so we've got a bit of a mixed answer here. We've got quite a few A's, a couple of C's. Now remember, you might have read about the freeze response in evaluation in your textbooks, guys, and it is something that the fight or flight response does not actually account for. Potentially it does account for things like speed, potentially athleticism in the moment, especially when it comes to flighting and running for your life, for example. So yeah, freeze is the one here that isn't accounted for in this fight or flight response, which is also a valid response in a stressful situation and can occur. So we need to remember that. And again, that point can really come into evaluative material there for that topic. All right, let's look at the next one. Why does gender matter when understanding the fight or flight response? A, B, or C? Great, I think we've got a majority answer here, which is the correct answer. It's really great to see, guys. Well done. Yeah, A, there are chemical differences in how we respond to stress, such as the higher production of oxytocin in females. Just on that note, because it ties in with the next question, what is the response called in terms of stress in females that research has kind of shown or highlighted? Can anybody remember? What's the response in females because we have that higher production of oxytocin? Not necessarily fight or flight. What's the female version called? Can anybody identify that before we move on to the next question? Yeah, tend and befriend. Really well done. Excellent. Karen getting in there first. Well done. Yes. So let's have a look at question 3 then. So for question 3, we've got who typically uses tend and befriend as a way to reduce their own stress. So again, this should be an easy, quick answer, guys. A, B, or is it C? Great. A coming through quickly. Excellent. Well done. It is, of course, females, and that research was done by someone called Taylor et al. Excellent. Let's look at the next question then. Which of the following terms is used to describe research into fight or flight? So think carefully about this. We've got quite a lot of scientific terms here on this slide: objective, subjective, paradigm. So again, this really comes into the features of science. So think about how we might measure the response to fight or flight. And I can see a few of us have already said A and gone with the answer A. Excellent. Really great. I think we've got a couple of mixed ones there, but not many. I think the majority there was A. Yeah, it is, of course, objective. And that really comes into power when we think, how do we actually measure fight or flight? So it's those physiological responses, okay, that adrenaline, for example. So let's have a look at our last one then here. Initial research into the fight or flight response was conducted on animals. Which of the following is the biggest problem with this? Yeah, excellent. So I think we've got a resounding A there so far. Yeah, absolutely. Extrapolating data from animals to humans can be quite tricky, and there can be generalization problems there. Yeah, well done, everybody. So we're going to have a look at an A02 question next. So Jodie is driving along the motorway to work when a car pulls out in front of her without indicating. Jodie manages to brake in time, but notices that her heart is thumping, her breathing is heavy, and her mouth is dry. So use your knowledge of the role of adrenaline in the fight or flight response to explain Jodie's reactions when the car pulls in front of her. Now, for 4 marks, what could you include in an answer to this question? I really want you to think about how you can really link the theory that we went through before on fight or flight with specifically what's going on in the STEM with Jodie. So any answers that kind of link with part of the theory, if not all of the theory, for the fight or flight response. How could we answer this one? Yeah, excellent. Well done, Lily Bark. Yeah, secretion of adrenaline from the adrenal medulla would result in blood pressure and circulation increasing, leading to an increase in heart rate. Yeah, excellent. So again, this is going to link to obviously the Jodie standing her ground potentially or running away quite quickly. Yeah, adrenaline stops digestion, so her mouth goes dry. Excellent, excellent application there to the STEM. Yep, sympathetic nervous system. Yeah, it does come into play, which obviously triggers the adrenal medulla to release that hormone adrenaline, noradrenaline, which then causes those symptoms. Excellent, well done. Yeah, ANS switches from the sympathetic to parasympathetic, which would trigger the fight. Yeah, so make sure that we don't get confused between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is what we're seeing here in the STEM, okay? Sympathetic nervous system is kind of triggering things to increase and make us alert for fight or flight. When the stress passes, this is when our rest and digest comes into play, and this is where we can relax and bring everything back to equilibrium, if you like. So here we've got the car pulling out in front of Jodie is a stressor. She perceives it to be a threat. She could have crashed into it. Then the hypothalamus in Jodie's brain would have activated the sympathetic medullary pathway, which would have therefore activated the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline. And obviously the adrenaline causes physiological changes within Jodie's body. So for example, that physiological arousal is needed to either stand her ground or fight or run away very quickly. Her heart is thumping because it's beating faster and she's breathing heavily because her respiration rate has increased. And then lastly, the adrenaline is also inhibited, as a lot of you have noticed, Jodie's saliva production, because we know when fight or flight is triggered, digestion is no longer an essential function, which is why her mouth is dry, okay? Okay then, I'm going to pass you back over to Sarah next.
Okay, so just to move on then to lateralization. So a reminder that lateralization is the idea that the two halves of our brain are functionally different and that each hemisphere has a different function. So for example, the left is dominant for language and the right is dominant for visual motor tasks. So you must know about split brain research. For example, you might be familiar with Sperry's study and Gazanga's study, but your teacher may have taught different piece of research. There has been a question recently on lateralization, and students tended to focus on a particular study, but the question can't ask you about Sperry's study, for example, because that name is not directly listed in the specification, although your teachers may commonly choose to use that. So there are other studies that you may prefer, your teachers may have taught you, and questions won't specifically ask you about the study. But you can, of course, get a question specifically asking you about lateralization or split brain research, and it requires more than just the general knowledge of what the study did, what the study found, and the evaluation of the study. So we need to know a little bit more than that. So let's move on then to plasticity and functional recovery. So these two work hand in hand, and you may have learned lots about brain plasticity and then functional recovery alongside it. So brain plasticity is all about how our brain is malleable and changing, and we consider it to be more plastic at a younger age. So it's much easier to learn things at a younger age than it is into adulthood, because your brain's ability to adapt and change is much more malleable. So we've said here about the brain's ability to change and adapt because of experience is much more frequent in a younger child. So at birth, each neuron in the cerebral cortex has approximately 2,500 synapses, and then by the age of 3, it increases to about 15,000 synapses. So the more we're learning, the more our brain is expanding and building these neural connections. However, as we go through age, unused connections are deleted, and this is called neural pruning, or sometimes synaptic pruning. So talking about functional recovery then. So functional recovery is all about improving our functioning of our brain if and when there is any damage. So sometimes damage can happen because of a disease or like a stroke, and sometimes it can be through like a physical trauma, perhaps from a car accident or a fall of some kind. But our brains are very clever and they do functionally recover. So the transfer of functions from a damaged area to undamaged areas, so areas of the brain that are not damaged can pick up the role and the function of the damaged area so that we can still perform those actions, which is really handy. It might not do it as well as the original area, but it can still perform an action, even if that's not its specialty. The brain recovers some functions quickly, so spontaneous recovery, it can recover kind of automatically, and in other cases, rehabilitation, neurorehabilitation is necessary and required. So for example, when someone's had a stroke, they may have damage to the areas of their brain that are controlling their language, and in order to learn to speak again and to produce words and to produce coherency in what they're saying, so to improve those kind of Broca and Burnix areas that might have been damaged, they might need some speech therapy rehabilitation to get that back functioning well. But our brains are very clever and are able to do it. So just moving on to our bubble quiz then. So this you might have seen before. You can give an answer. It might just be one of the bubbles, it might be all of the bubbles. So let's have a look at our first question then. Which of these limitations of split brain research, which of these are limitations of split brain research? So in the chat, can you put A, B, C, or D? It might be one of them, it might be all of them. So have a read. Reliant on observations. Split brain research is reliant on self-report data. It's reliant on small sample sizes, or it's subjective. So which one is a key limitation of split brain research? Could be all of them, could just be one. We've got a mix of answers in the chat, and I'm conscious of time, so let's have a look at our answer. Our answer is small sample sizes. Generally, split brain research tends to have really small sample sizes because it's not common to have a split brain and to have that surgery to remove that corpus callosum or to sever it. So we tend to have small sample sizes, unfortunately, with this research. Okay, let's have a look at number 2. Again, A, B, C, or D, or all of them. So which of these studies supports the plasticity of the brain? So Gray looks at the first response to danger is a freeze response. Heresty, women have larger Broca and Burnix areas than men. Kuhn said about grey matter in the brain increases after playing video games for 30 minutes a day for 2 months. And then Turk said about a patient with the left hemisphere damage developed the capacity to speak in the right hemisphere. So what do we think? A, B, C, or D? We've got a bit of a mix coming through there again in the chat. So I can see some correct answers. Really well done. Response C was the correct answer there. Well done. Let's have a look at another one. So again, A, B, C, or D, or all of them. Rogers et al. In 2004 found that domestic chickens could find food and be vigilant of predators at the same time. What does this support? Does it support lateralization of brain functions, functional recovery of the brain after trauma, fight or flight, or Broca's area? What does this appear to be relevant? They could find food and be vigilant of predators at the same time. So doing two things at once. A, B, C, or D, or all of them. I see a correct answer popped up. Let's have a look at our answer. It is lateralization and brain functions. Fantastic, well done. Let's have a look at one more and then we'll move on to our last bit. So what has knowledge of plasticity and functional recovery of the brain helped to develop? So A, B, C, or D, or all of them. So electric convulsive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, neuroplasticity, or flooding. A, B, C, or D. So knowledge of plasticity and functional recovery. What has that helped to develop? Really good. Excellent. Well done for your contributions. Well done if you're thinking C. C is our answer there. Fantastic. And we're gonna finish it up there. So thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions there. Sorry we ran out of time. We're a bit ambitious about how much we wanted to get through. But remember, you'll be able to download the slides and look through our extra tasks that we've added in there. So we recommend you can do that for some extra revision. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, guys. We've got next week an hour-long session on attachment, and that is our last one before we do our big tour for Grade Booster. So if you still haven't booked onto Grade Booster, you can still get tickets, I think, for a couple of the venues. Otherwise, we will see you next week, same time. Please remember the schedule is up on our Instagram. That's Tutor2Psych if you wanted to be in tune with when we're going to be back on our lives. But these will be consistent after Grade Booster leading up to your exam. So thanks so much, guys, for your time and your efforts this evening, and we'll see you next week.